Today is Tuesday, September 26th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. A few days ago, I posted a talk about classical studies and modern scholarship, and got a bit of feedback on that talk from folks who'd like to get into that topic a little more, and so I'd like to do that in this talk here. I'd like to talk a little bit more about classical studies and modern scholarship, because I really don't think that many Christian people understand what modern scholarship is. Modern scholarship is often criticized as some sort of vain, useless, professional gibberish, but it doesn't take much reflection to realize that universities wouldn't be paying salaries to professors and researchers if they really weren't doing anything productive or valuable. The truth is that scholarship really is an extension of the scientific method, and when it's employed within its limits and for the right purposes, it's extremely beneficial to everyone. But at the same time, like the scientific method, scholarship is simply an instrument. It's a means by which we pursue some end that we're already committed to as sort of a vocational pursuit of our own interest. Remember that the mission of the Catholic laity is to direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. We're drawn by many different factors to different areas of influence. I, for example, was drawn into classical studies as a 19-year-old. But there were reasons why I was attracted to classical studies. Other students are drawn into medical studies or legal studies or politics or religion, whatever it may be. We have our own interests. We have our own mission field, as it were, as Catholic laymen. And scholarship is a necessary instrument in the pursuit of that end or that vocation, and it needs to be understood as such. Now, I learned this when I was an undergraduate student in college. I was majoring in classics and ancient history, and I was a Christian who was very interested in biblical studies, especially ancient Near Eastern studies, which have to do with understanding the history and cultures of the Old Testament times. And as I got into ancient historical studies, I had to get into archaeology quite a bit. Now, when we're new to a subject, as most students are, we're learning the data, as it were. We're learning the basic facts of these different fields of research and study. We're learning the names of places. We're learning what has been found in different places. We're looking at artifacts. We're looking at texts that have been discovered. And we're seeing these things for the first time. We're just learning about the what of research and these studies. We don't even know what information exists. The same is true in other fields. If we went into chemistry, for example, or law or politics, we would simply be learning about people and events and works that were influential and so on. We don't even know the basic content of these fields of study. And through our school years, which ideally would start when we're younger, if we didn't waste so much time on nonsense, we would start learning the content of these different fields while we're young. Because the real work of scholarship doesn't necessarily have to do with the content of these different studies. And I'll illustrate from my own experience. I had a well-known ancient history professor who I took a number of courses with. He was an atheist. He was a great professor. I had a great relationship with him. He was very respectful towards me because I was a straight A student. And he actually wrote a recommendation letter for me when I applied to graduate school, and wrote that I was the most academically honest student he had ever had. And the reason I share that is just because this professor and I had a very good personal relationship. I would be in his office all the time. We chatted back and forth on email. I was a very zealous Christian. He was an atheist, but we had a very good relationship. We used to argue about ancient history stuff all the time, and I started to get into archaeology at that time. Now, what was strange as I got into archaeology is that I started to read a magazine which is called Biblical Archaeology Review, or BAR. And in that magazine, there would always be these reports of discoveries that were made at different archaeological sites, and then there would be explanations of what these things signify and what they mean and how they relate to our knowledge of biblical history and things like that. And I found that stuff very, very interesting. I was learning about these different archaeological sites that were being excavated and studied. I was learning about all the different artifacts and texts that had been discovered. To me, this was all new. So I was just collecting information about all of this stuff that was being gathered. But as I got into those ancient studies more and had to work on papers and projects for those studies, I had to also study other journals, other archaeological journals, which were pursued from a different perspective, more of this secular, agnostic perspective. What surprised me as I got into these other sources was that the atheist or the agnostic archaeologists were aware of all of the discoveries that were written about in Biblical Archaeology Review. The atheists and the agnostics, as well as the Bible-believing Christian archaeologists, all had access to the same stuff, to the same data, as it were, the same artifacts, the same discoveries, the same sites, the same texts. They worked together on these sites. They excavated these sites together. They shared all of the information and knew everything that everyone else knew about the content that was available for archaeological study. And that surprised me because I tended to think that, well, the atheists must just not know about this stuff. Because the biblical archaeologists, man, they're finding evidence of the life of King David and all of the confirmations of these different biblical stories and biblical history and things like that. I thought, well, those atheist archaeologists, those agnostic they must just not know about this stuff, or they must just deny it. But then, as I said, when I started to study their archaeological writings, I found that that was not true, that they were aware of all of those discoveries. But the question in scholarship was not really about the content of archaeology. It was about the interpretation of that content. And so the questions that the scholars dealt with was not what did we find or what do we have. the question that the scholars wrote about were, what does this stuff actually tell us? What does this actually mean? How should we interpret these finds that have been made? And so it was an effort to put together plausible explanations. And pay attention to this, because this is the most important part. Plausible explanations based on one's beliefs and assumptions. It was an attempt to explain how one's pre-existing opinions, beliefs, principles, and so on could be reconciled with the data. For a biblical archaeologist, when something was pulled out of the ground, it was immediately examined through the lens of the knowledge of the content of the Bible. If there was a name inscribed into a wall or on some possession, it was considered whether that name was a name of some character in the Bible. And the Bible was used as an interpretive grid for whatever was discovered. Whereas the atheists and agnostics, when they discovered something, they did not necessarily run it through the grid of the Bible, but they ran it through their own theories and systems of historical understanding, and they interpreted it in a different way. And so I realized that the work of archaeology is not so much about the what of the actual discoveries made by archaeologists, but it was about the so what. It was about the interpretation of it. And that this was the real work of scholarship, was to explain how what we know and what we have through archaeological research influences what we think about religion, about different philosophies, about different controversial points of history, and so on. It really is a question of interpretation. Now, when I learned that, I actually lost a lot of my interest in archaeology, because what made me so interested in it was the idea of finding artifacts or texts that proved my point. But really, that's not how it works, because everyone has the freedom to interpret the finds for themselves. And it wasn't so simple. And really, when you've got a plausible worldview, just about everything can be made to fit into that worldview. And so I found that work of arguing over archaeological stuff really wasn't as exciting and interesting as I thought it was in my ignorance. But it reveals an important point about scholarship. We talk about religious liberty and freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and so on. And we go into these studies with existing religious convictions. In many schools, in many places, we're made to think that we're wrong to do that we should go in with a quote-unquote open mind, which really means an empty mind. We should go in with no assumptions, with no articles of faith, as it were, and we should rely entirely on our observations. But this really isn't what scholarship does. The people who usually say that are ignorant people. The people who pretend that we should enter into discussions with open minds, with no prior convictions or theories or opinions, are usually people who don't know what they're talking about. Because when we get into these studies, we find that there are different perspectives, different camps, different groups, and they're all aware of the available information. The idea that this group thinks what they think because they're just dumb and they don't know about the information is a sign of ignorance, because that's not how it really works. We see this all the time among Christians. Catholics will criticize Protestants by quoting some historical event as if no Protestants are aware of that. And they'll imagine that their knowledge of that event is like a silver bullet that destroys Protestantism, as if Protestants would have no answer if they knew of that event. And yet we'll find that there are very highly educated historians and scholars who are Protestants who know all those details and also have an explanation for them. And they don't find that they contradict Protestant teaching at all. Protestants do the same thing to Catholics. A Protestant will mock and criticize a Catholic and then quote a Bible verse as if in 2,000 years of Catholic history, no Catholic teachers ever realized that that verse was in the Bible. Ignorant people do this. People who are learning the basics, learning about the content of the sciences, and arrogantly imagine that no one else has ever known what they know, assume that the knowledge of it is the proof. And this isn't true. This idea that knowing the data or being familiar with the evidence is the end of the discussion is really a mark of ignorance and a lack of respect for other perspectives, as if everyone who disagrees with you is just stupid and doesn't know any of the information. That's not true. As I said, my ancient history professor knew everything. He knew the Old Testament, the New Testament, he knew Hebrew, he knew Greek, he knew the history of the ancient world, and he was an atheist. And so I couldn't simply think to have a persuasive conversation with him that I would show him a passage in the Bible that simply stated something that he was ignorant of, and it would be like an obvious slap in the face, and he would say, "Oh, well, I never knew that was..." Of course, he knew all of the passages of Scripture. He knew all of the history. But he interpreted it and explained it and put it together in different ways. And the question is not really about the information or the data. The question and the controversy is really in the interpretation of the data, whether the interpretation is possible or impossible. Because if someone comes up with a different explanation, and that different explanation truly reconciles with all of the information, there's not much we can say against it. And Christians have a hard time with that because, if we're honest, we believe things that really there's no evidence for us to believe. And to hold unbelievers accountable to knowledge that is drawn from faith rather than observation or reasoning really doesn't make much sense. It's like yelling at a blind man because he doesn't share your opinion of the visible evidence. When we acknowledge that we think a certain thing or believe a certain thing because it's contained in divine revelation, we have to realize that we're the ones who are going out on a limb and saying, oh, I believe that. I believe that. Whereas an unbeliever is going to look at us and say, how can you just say, I believe that? You have to have evidence to support it. And we would say, well, the evidence that I have is the fact that God said it. And you see how there's a disconnect there. For some reason, we receive divine revelation, and we're convinced that it's true. We say this, if you know the prayer, the act of faith, we say we believe this because it's been revealed by God, who can neither deceive nor be deceived. And it's just, yeah, it's obvious. We believe this because God said it. And the unbeliever scratches his head and says, that's what we're trying to prove. And so there's sort of this circular argument built in to Christian faith that we have to acknowledge. And when we acknowledge that and respect the difficulty that unbelievers have with accepting what we accept, we can listen to their arguments and actually respect them, because it's not reasonable that they would believe. It's not reasonable that they would accept as true and certain things that we receive by faith. That's not reasonable. But the issue is ultimately the examination of these different interpretations. And this sort of brings us to the wisdom of Socrates. Socrates, you'll notice, when he sought to examine men's philosophical views, he doesn't appeal to objective information. He doesn't appeal to facts outside of the person he's speaking with. What you'll notice about Socrates is that he stays within the person's own knowledge and answers to questions. And this is the wisdom of the Socratic method, the true Socratic method, not the fake Socratic method that fake classical schools talk about, which is just class discussion. What Socrates is doing is he's examining the system of thought of another person, and he's not seeking to hold it accountable to objective facts outside of himself and outside of this other person, because he knows that's a waste of time. He knows that's not really the issue. The issue is the interpretation of those facts, of that information. And because we contain in our own minds a system that explains, that interprets and explains the things around us, Socrates enters into another person's system, as it were, and begins asking the person for his system's answers to all the different questions. And Socrates seeks to show one thing. He seeks to show that inside that system there are self-contradictions that reveal the impossibility of that system. And so what Socrates does, which is the most important challenge that we face in this work, Socrates leads people to doubt their system. That's what Socrates does. He leads them to doubt their system by showing them that there are contradictions within that system, making it impossible to be true. And Socrates would argue that a true interpretation, a true system of thought, no matter how rigorously examined, would be found to have no internal contradictions. And you see how Socrates does not get into a discussion, an ignorant discussion about the facts or the data. Because ultimately, as I said, the question is about what the data means, or what the information, how the information is interpreted. So Socrates grants that reality, goes inside the other person's system, sincerely inquires and learns about the other person's system, and then pays careful attention to discover contradictions. And he uses those contradictions as the means of attacking and destroying those systems of belief. This is the real work of scholarship. This is the real work of scholarship. And when you think about it like this, it's a fascinating challenge. Socrates, however, models for us, most importantly, a sincere interest in the thoughts of others. He asks questions. He lets them do the talking. He doesn't lecture. He doesn't write books. He asks questions and he learns from other people's own mouths the details of their systems of belief. And as he asks questions and listens to their responses, he discerns areas of trouble. And then he begins to zero in on those areas of trouble. And eventually, if the system is in fact false, he sort of corners those he speaks with in those places where the contradictions can be found. Now, Plato, writing the dialogues, makes this appear to be a very convenient process. But remember, these are Plato's written dialogues or summaries of the dialogues of Socrates. Socrates' actual dialogues were probably far less efficient than we read of in Plato's written dialogues. Sometimes a discussion may lead to no contradiction at all. Sometimes everything may seem perfectly sound. And as the discussion continues, maybe for months, maybe for years, and all of the different members of the discussion continue their studies and continue their own reasonings and investigations, here and there something pops up as a potential cause of trouble, and the discussion is resumed. And eventually, some chinks in the armor are uncovered. This is the real work of scholarship. And as I said, as such, when we think of it in this way, we can understand how significant it is, because entire industries can be held up by false interpretations of data. And those interpretations of data can go on unquestioned for decades. The industries can be held up because it's assumed that a certain interpretation is true, and it's not examined. It's not put to the test. And it takes a diligent and sometimes a creative scholar to examine what might be considered beyond examination. And if this internal flaw is found in the system of explanation or interpretation of the data, and it can be exposed, that can lead to a breakthrough in scholarship which allows an entire industry or an entire field of learning to move forward. And that's really the goal of scholarship. It's really, though it's not pursued in this way, it's really the same kind of Socratic investigation that seeks to find the flaws in existing systems of thought, so that what is false can be set aside as an option not to be pursued, and the whole investigation in seeking the truth can move forward, taking a step ahead. And this is how true scholarship, not obviously there is lots and lots of fake garbage scholarship where people are just pretending to do scholarly work for the sake of the gratification of seeing journal articles they've written published in some obscure journal that they can add to their resume. But the real work of scholarship has to do with advancing human knowledge in whatever different area we're called to work in, for the good of all human beings. It's really a public work, a work for the good of our neighbors that we enter into, and we use our religious convictions, our reasoning powers, which hopefully we're developing and improving, develop our research skills, develop our awareness of all of the available data and information that goes into the discussion, studies to carefully learn the systems of interpretation that others have developed, and then investigates the details of them to find if there's anything that doesn't follow, that isn't consistent. And then to focus on those weak points and possibly destroy false systems of interpretation, which is like removing a clog that allows the entire system to move forward. That's the real challenge of scholarship. And I think if Christians understood that more clearly, if they understood that really in modern scholarship we have that same challenge of ancient philosophy, but set in a different context, following a different method, I think that Christians would find it very attractive to enter into those fields and to work to reach a level of expertise that allows them to become critical, but to also realize that the principal means by which one becomes critical is by questioning, by sincerely seeking to learn the details of what others are saying, because the problems eventually reveal themselves. Now, the reason why I always criticize Christians for thinking about college as a place to go and isolate oneself, go to a Christian college, go to a Catholic college, as if we're going to keep all of the bad guys out, is because that undermines the whole point of scholarship. It undermines the whole point of learning. It underlines the whole idea of Socratic examination. This idea that in order to practice the Socratic method, I need to go to my Catholic liberal arts college where all of the bad ideas are kept out, contradicts the whole point of Socratic investigation. It's like saying I want to go and develop my sword fighting by living with all of my allies. It doesn't make any sense. And that's what I think is wrong with modern Christian or Catholic colleges. I think that we get these adults together that really should be engaging with different perspectives and learning how to actually do the work of real scholarship. And instead we're still hiding these people inside these echo chambers of schools where everyone is like-minded, and they embarrassingly walk around talking like they're these free thinkers open to all ideas and confident in their systems of belief, and yet they're obviously not comfortable outside of a controlled environment. And that's why I don't think that those schools are necessarily helpful. I look back at my experience at a secular university, like I said, this professor I had, and I can look back and say that relationship made me confident in my faith, because when I put my faith to the test, when I trusted in the principles of Christian thinking, I always found in time that they came out on top. And I gained confidence as a Christian by actually being in that contest with real adversaries present, getting questions and challenges from real opponents. Not from some, classmate or professor who actually shares all my views and pretends to be the devil's advocate and represents the other perspective, but not really. I can say that I am 100% settled and confident in my Catholic faith, and it's because as I was developing as a Christian, I was subjected to unfiltered attacks from others. I can remember, and I may talk about this in other talks, but I can remember going home from some of my classes, going back to my apartment, and just flopping face down on the couch, overwhelmed with confusion because one of my professors or classmates raised an argument against Christianity that I really didn't have an answer for. And I remember times where I was just flustered and overcome by those discussions. And I just had to keep studying and keep working and keep praying and keep thinking and keep arguing and keep working through all of the details of the discussions until finally I would have a breakthrough and I'd find the point where the objection was refutable or where a response given by someone else could be objected to. And I had to learn to do that. And there were times where it was very difficult. But that's the exercise we need. That's the exercise we need. And you can't fake it. You can't fake that exercise. I tell my kids this all the time because I grew up playing sports, competitive sports, and my kids have grown up and they're more like fitness. They like to exercise and work out, to run and train and things like that. And I've explained to them the difference between playing competitive sports and fitness. In fitness, you sort of set the bar for how difficult the workout's going to be. You decide how many sets and reps you're going to do. You decide what your workout's going to be. But when you play competitive sports, the competition sets the bar, and you have no choice. If we're playing football and we're playing against an opponent that's big and strong and fast, and they've got a scheme that's difficult for us to handle, the quality of the opponent sets the bar, and we can't say, well, we're going to do this many sets or this many reps, or we're going to push ourselves this hard. We have to meet the challenge of our opponent. And it's much different, or it's very different from going running every day or going to the gym where you're just constantly trying to beat your personal record, your personal best. In competitive sports, your personal best is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if today you played better than yesterday, because if your opponent is a lot better than you, you just lose. It doesn't matter if you did better. It's all relative to your opponent. And that's why I think being immersed with real proponents of differing views is more like competitive sports intellectually, whereas going to a Christian college is more like working out at the gym and just keeping track of your personal best in each different exercise. It's very different. So this, I really believe, is the work of scholarship. It's really the work of defending the faith. It's really the work of seeking the errors, seeking the internal contradictions of other systems of thought and trying to pull them down. And I don't know how there's any more exciting and significant work for lay Catholics who are gifted intellectually than this work of combative scholarship, which is how I look at it. So having said all that, how do we get started in this? I think one problem that modern students have, no matter what age you are, one problem modern students have is they think that, well, I have to finish my school, and then I have to go to college, and then I have to get a master's degree, and then maybe I'll go for my PhD, and then I'll pursue a career as a scholar. I'll do research and get into all this stuff because I really like the idea of doing this kind of work. But that doesn't make any sense. That might have made sense 50 years ago, but it doesn't make sense in the 21st century, because everything that you're going to have access to as a professional scholar, you have access to now. You have access to all of the research materials, you have access to the research databases, you have access to libraries, you have access to all of these things now. And you need to be using them now. You need to be working now. You need to be researching now. You need to be writing now. You need to be developing these skills now. And you need to do it on your own for a couple of important reasons. And I'll give an illustration for this. When I decided to start the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I remember people telling me, like, well, you're going to need to find an accountant. You're going to need to find an accountant to give you direction for how to run your business. And as I thought about that, I said to myself, I really don't know how this business ought to be run. I mean, there's nobody else teaching the classical liberal arts. There's no one else doing what I'm going to do. So how can I go to an accountant and say, hey, Mr. Accountant, who has no idea what I'm doing, how should I do it? I didn't think that that was a very good idea. What I said to myself was, I need to learn the principles of accounting so that I can know all of my options and I can develop my own method that best suits my academic work. And so through the years, that's what I've done. I've used my own study of accounting, my own experience with filing taxes and things like that, to figure out what the best way of handling my financial obligations is based on the unique conditions of the work that I do. I developed my own way, my own method for my own business. And that's given me a lot of freedom in how I manage things. It's also helped me to make a lot of decisions where I think accountants would have directed me down a common path, but there were other paths available that I don't think the accountants would have told me about unless I sought them out myself. For example, when everyone says, oh, you work in education, you should consider setting up a non-profit organization. Well, that was sort of the universal advice, but as I looked into it more and more, I started to see red flags for reasons why I did not want to have my educational work set up as a non-profit organization. And so I chose to keep it as a private, for-profit business rather than this modern non-profit organization. And when we get into scholarship, when we get into our work in researching and studying and writing, we have to develop our own methods. We have to develop our own personality, our own spirit, as it were. That's what actually makes us significant in these discussions. We don't want to be carbon copies of people that already exist. We don't want to learn to do what other people are already doing. We want to be disruptive in a way. We want to be different. We want to get into these fields that are stagnant, and we want to stir them up. And in order to do that, we need to develop our own approach, our own style, our own perspective. And that's why I think it's important for us to get right to work on these things, to bring our own convictions, our own philosophical principles into these fields immediately, to start writing immediately, to start speaking immediately, and give ourselves time to develop our own style, our own perspective, our own personality, and so on. This is the opposite of what most people do. Most people won't do that for a very simple reason. It's embarrassing. It's risky. But that's like saying that you don't want to go to football practice or play in a game because you're not good yet and you might get embarrassed. Well, that sounds clever, but the problem is this is how you get better. You get better by getting on the field and getting run over. I remember the first time I played defensive end in high school football. I had never played the position before, and we were playing against one of the best teams in the state. And they ran, I don't know how much you know about football, but they ran a wishbone offense, and they ran a triple option, and they ran it so fast, and it was so confusing, and there was motion all over the place, that in my first game ever playing defensive end, I just had no idea what to expect. I couldn't possibly anticipate the speed at which the game moved. And I remember my coach telling me, look, you've got one job. You've got one job. You're the defensive end. Your job is to contain the offense, to keep them inside, to drive them towards the linebackers, towards the defensive linemen. Don't let them get outside. So I went onto the field, understanding my role was just to keep containment, to keep everything inside of me. And that sounded like a simple task until the first play, where one aspect of the offense that I wasn't told about was that they could have not only fullbacks and tailbacks and quarterbacks moving all over the place, but they could also have guards, big linemen, pulling from the other side of the line and coming down across the line of scrimmage to try to take out the defensive end, which was me. And so the first play, I remember the ball was snapped. I took off into my position from the line. I had the quarterback in my sight. I was committed. I was not going to let anyone get outside of me. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I was steamrolled by a guard coming from the other side of the play. And I remember being humiliated and embarrassed, but that was the last time I needed to be told to watch out for pulling guards. And that's how we learn. And the only way we can get better is to get out there and gain experience. And most people are not willing to do that. And we have to learn to be willing to do that. We have to learn that when we put ourselves out on the field and we start gaining that experience, much of which comes the hard way, we're learning the lessons that other people have not started to learn yet. We're gaining experience, we're gaining understanding, we're gaining wisdom that people who are afraid to come on the field are not yet gaining. And that's how we actually get ahead and become wise. That's how we become skillful. We have to learn many of these things the hard way, and the only way to gain real skill in these areas is to get out into the arena and start playing. And this is where I think Christians really drop the ball, because they won't do it. And I've been telling Christians to do this for years. I've been telling Christians to start blogs, write articles, start a YouTube channel, publish talks, make videos. It doesn't matter if they're simple. It doesn't matter if they're crude. The goal of these videos is not to change the world. You're a nobody. You're insignificant. You have no audience. You have no influence. The goal of these articles and talks and videos is for you to begin gaining experience, for you to begin developing your own style, your own personality, your own message, and so on. And the other important aspect of this is that when you get into studies, I was just talking to my wife about this the other day, because she's about to resume graduate studies herself. I told her that when you go into studies, you have to have some practical application in mind. You can't just go into studies because the studies are limitless. It's like going into an ocean and the water just is everywhere. It's a mile deep and 1,000 miles wide. You can't go into intellectual pursuits or into academics for the sake of academics. It sounds cute, but the problem is you end up in this ocean of omniscience that you're never going to make progress in. There needs to be some restriction on your studies, and that restriction needs to be some practical application, some apostolate, some mission that you're seeking to fulfill. For me, it was the restoration of classical liberal arts education. That was my practical application. when I was an undergraduate student and had whole libraries accessible to me, I would have died. I literally used to walk into the libraries and get chest pains because there was so much material and I was so overwhelmed by it. But when I started to realize what my goal was, that I wanted to restore classical liberal arts education, it set limits on my studies, gave me a focus. When I read a book, I'm thinking to myself, what does this tell me about classical liberal arts education? How can I use this in restoring classical liberal arts education? How can this help me to learn more about classical liberal arts education? The practical application that I had in mind limited my studies and gave them a focus. And we've got to do that. So you've got that's part of your vocation, is you've got to ask, what problem do I want to solve? What problem am I passionate about solving? What problem do I want to devote my life to and try to solve? That's how scholarship can fulfill a real sense of vocation for us. What problem do I want to solve? And it can be in any area, because remember, the mission of the Catholic laity is to direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. That does not mean direct all temporal affairs, because that would be impossible. It's to take your specific focus, your specific mission, and seek to direct that according to God's will. And you need to develop that mission. You need to develop that focus. And the only way that you can do that is to get started. To get started asking yourself, what problem do I want to solve? What problem is there that just gets under my skin and gets my blood boiling, that I could devote my whole life to fighting against? That's the kind of thing that we need to find. You know, if I wasn't involved in classical education, if that was not the mission that I had chosen to pursue, I probably would be engaged in working to destroy the theory of evolution. That's another one of those subjects where I say to myself, if there was one thing I would like to do, I would just like to annihilate the theory of evolution. I would like to devote my whole academic career to finding the flaws in the arguments of the theory of evolution and proving it impossible. That would be the kind of thing I'd be interested in. But you've got to identify what it is that you want to fight against or fight for. You know, you could say, I want to devote my scholastic career to promoting Marian devotion by teaching and articulating and explaining it more clearly than it's ever been explained before. You need to have an application. You need to have a goal. It could be in any field. You could say, in the legal field, you know, I really hate how our society does this, and I want to devote myself to destroying this problem in the legal field. And then direct all of your studies and all of your reading and writing and talking and arguing to that topic, to develop real skill, to discover the best arguments, the best lines of argument, and so on, over years and years and years of academic work. That's how scholarship can fulfill one's vocation. But the key is you've got to start. You've got to start doing the things that scholars do, and not pretend like, oh yeah, well, when I get my this degree and when I get that. The reason why that won't work is because you'll just become a normal, ordinary member of the academic community, and you won't have your own personality, you won't have your own message, you won't have your own style, you won't have your own clear mission, and you'll just be useless. You'll just be useless. Like There are college professors with PhDs who teach at cheesy community colleges. They're not academics, they're not researchers, they're not doing this work that I call combative scholarship. That's what you'll end up with if you just go through degree programs, check boxes, get your paperwork, and then fall into some bottom level academic position, but really have nothing to do with this work of Christian scholarship. The only way that you're going to develop your own style and personality and mission and message is by getting started, entering into difficult situations, getting into discussions and arguments constantly, and learning to pursue those arguments in a scholarly way. That is not necessarily by wasting hours on social media, although that can sometimes be helpful to get things started, just like a Wikipedia search can sometimes help you to get started studying a field. A simple social media argument can be helpful just to get your thoughts going, but to learn how to pursue those issues and pursue those questions by the use of real academic resources like scholarly journals, library resources, and things like that. You've got to learn the tools of the trade, and you've got to become really good with them so that you can become a cunning worker. And the only way you're going to do that is by entering into the contest itself. That's what I would like most of all to see Christian people do. I'd like to see Christian people start to write articles and start to post talks and start to actually do things where they get themselves into the field, get themselves into the discussion, even if it's in isolation, even if it's in obscurity and nobody, you've got no views on your videos and no one's following your blog, or it doesn't matter. The exercise itself is the beginning of that work. And you're going to learn from the exercise itself. And then once you get over that first hump of, let's say, writing your first article or making your first YouTube video where you talk about a topic and you seek to explain the topic and argue it persuasively, once you get over that hump, you'll now find yourself facing new questions and new problems. Like, okay, well, I made 20 videos and I think they're pretty good. How do I now get these videos in front of people? Well, that's a different question. That's a new part of this work. Or, I've written this article. How do I get someone to read? How do I distribute these articles? How do I get people reading my articles? That's a new part of the work of scholarship. And so as you get yourself over each hump, you'll face a new challenge, and you'll work then to get yourself over that next hump. And you'll continue to do that before you even get into any formal academic position. You'll also develop experience. You'll also be developing skills that you use in your courses in college or in graduate school. You'll be developing the skills in your free time that you need in your formal academic work. You'll be studying things in your free time that will benefit you when you take different courses in college. You won't be waiting for the professor to tell you what to study, and then when there's nothing left to study, just be free and sit around playing video games. You'll be doing your own studies and using the knowledge and the skills that you gain from your own studies in your courses. And this is how you make a mark in academia. And most students don't do this. And it's why they really never develop a real mission for their academic work. But if you're going to get into scholarship as a career, as a life's work, as a vocation and mission, You're going to have to pursue it in a competitive way, not as a job where you just want to know, what do I need to do to get a job? Because that's just not how it works, unless you want one of these bottom of the barrel positions. Teaching the lowest level of students at the lowest level of institutions where there's no real academic work being done at all. So as far as a second talk on this question of classical studies and modern scholarship, I think we have to realize that though the discussions look different, it's really the same issue that Socrates dealt with in his day. The method is simply different. And we have to learn to use this method, to work within this method. The same wisdom applies, the same strategies apply, the same art of reasoning applies, the same art of rhetoric applies, the same question of whether we're willing to do the work applies. It's simply a different set of rules. It's like going from football to rugby. There's a lot that's different, but really it comes down to the same skills. It comes down to playing hard. It comes down to practicing the basic skills of the game, gaining experience at game level speeds, and committing to getting better. It's a different game, but at the same time, it's the same challenge. I think if we understand that, we can enter into it with advantages over others who don't have the benefit of classical learning that we would have. So I hope that's helpful to get wheels turning. But like I said, if you're not going to get to work now, I don't think you're ever going to get to work, because the obstacles that are in front of you today, wherever you are, those same obstacles are going to be in front of you at some later time. And so the same excuses you make to avoid getting to work in these things today, you're going to make the same excuses in the future. And if you get to work seeking to overcome them today, you'll already have a head start, maybe even success, in having yourself in position later to do some damage. And I think that's where most Christians err in modern society. They just sit around treading water in the ocean, really doing nothing, rather than getting to work with their life's mission, getting to work with their own interests and pursuits, and realizing that the same tools that they're going to have in 10 years from now, they've already got access to today, and they need to get to work with them. We see this in other fields. We see kids getting to work in computer programming and things like that, and already being ahead of adults when they're in their teen years. But in other areas, we don't apply that same entrepreneurial go get after it spirit that we should in scholarship, because all the tools are available to us. We've got to get to work with them and stop making excuses to wait and wait and wait, because nothing's really going to change. I hope that's helpful.